The bread felt impossibly warm against Ragnar's palm, though logic told him it should have been cold and stale. He stared at the woman who had given it to him, this skeletal stranger whose ribs pressed against her tattered dress, like the bars of a cage. Behind her, two children peered from the shadows of a makeshift shelter built from fallen branches, their hollow eyes reflecting the same desperate hunger that had driven lesser men to madness. "I cannot," he whispered, his voice rough from days of silence. The words felt foreign on his tongue. In 45 years of living, Ragnar Ironwolf had never refused anything offered freely, but neither had he ever been given something that meant the difference between life and death for the giver. "You must," she replied, and her smile was radiant despite her cracked lips. "The gods test us not by what we take, but by what we give when giving seems impossible." A chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the evening air. Those words, they echoed something his grandmother had whispered to him as a boy, back when he still believed in things beyond sword and shield. Before conquest had replaced wonder, before he had learned that kings took what they needed and called it justice. The woman's eyes met his directly, and for a heartbeat, Ragnar felt exposed, not as the disguised wanderer he pretended to be, but as the king who had failed these lands. Could she see through his carefully maintained facade? Did she know that beneath these beggars' rags beat the heart of the man whose armies had taken grain from a dozen villages to feed his warriors through the winter? "Your children," he managed, nodding toward the shelter where the little ones waited with the terrible patience of those who had learned not to expect mercy from the world. They need their mother to remember what it means to be human," she interrupted gently. "As do we all, when darkness falls upon the land." The bread remained warm in his hands, growing warmer still as twilight crept through the skeletal trees. Around them, the dying forest seemed to hold its breath. No bird song, no rustle of small creatures seeking shelter, only the profound silence of a world waiting for something to break. Ragnar had walked for 7 days through his drought-ravaged kingdom, witnessing suffering that cut deeper than any blade. Withered crops, empty wells, families fleeing south with nothing but the clothes on their backs. His advisors had spoken of trade routes and tribute from conquered lands, but they had never mentioned this, the way hope died slowly in a mother's eyes as she watched her children fade. "What is your name?" he asked, though part of him feared the answer. "I am called Astrid," she said, and somehow the simple word carried weight, as if it held meanings beyond what mortal tongues could express. "And you, wanderer? What name do you carry through these troubled lands?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. He could not give his true name, King Ragnar Ironwolf, the Iron Fist of the North, the Scourge of the Eastern Seas. Those titles belonged to golden halls and feasting warriors, not to this place of shadows and sacrifice. "Olaf," he said finally, choosing his father's name. "I am between homes." Her laugh was like silver bells, completely at odds with her starved appearance. "Between homes," she repeated. "Yes, I think we are all between homes now, until the rains return and the earth remembers how to bloom." The bread seemed to pulse in his hands, warm as fresh baked, though it was clearly days old. The absurdity of it struck him. Here stood a woman offering her children's salvation to a stranger while he commanded granaries full of grain in distant fortresses. If she knew the truth, would she curse him? Would those starlight eyes fill with the hatred he deserved? Instead, she reached out and closed his fingers around the bread with hands that trembled from weakness, but moved with infinite gentleness. "Eat," she whispered. "Let someone who has remembered love feed you, just this once." The words hit him like a physical blow. When had anyone last offered him something without expecting conquest or gold in return? When had he last received anything that wasn't tribute wrung from defeated enemies or loyalty bought with the promise of plunder? As Astrid turned back toward her children, Ragnar noticed something that made his breath catch. Despite her emaciated frame, despite the rags that barely covered her, she moved with a grace that seemed to belong to a different world entirely. Each step left no mark on the dusty earth, and the dying light seemed to gather around her like a cloak made of stars. The bread burned in his hands now, hot as forge fire but somehow not painful, and in that heat, in the impossible warmth radiating from this simple gift, Ragnar felt something stirring that he had thought dead, the capacity for wonder. What manner of woman gave away salvation and smiled while doing it? And why did the very air around her shimmer as if reality itself held its breath, waiting to reveal secrets that could shatter the world he thought he knew? The bread's warmth pulsed against his palm like a living heart as Ragnar watched Astrid disappear into the shadows with her children. Only when their whispered voices faded into the forest's silence did he allow himself to truly consider what he held and what awaited him beyond this moment of impossible grace. 7 days ago, he had been King Ragnar Ironwolf, seated upon the carved throne of his ancestors in the great hall of Ironhold. Warriors had knelt before him seeking glory, jarls had brought tribute from distant holdings, and scribes had read reports of grain stores and battle preparations. The routine of absolute power, as familiar as breathing, as crushing as stone. He could return to that world with a single command. Even now, Captain Bjorn waited 3 leagues north with a hand-picked company of his most trusted men, believing their king pursued rumors of enemy movements along the border. A horn call would bring them running, and by dawn he could be back in his fortress, surrounded by warmth and plenty while his people starved in silence. The thought made his stomach turn. How many nights had he sat in his great chair, drinking mead from golden cups while families like Astrid's counted their last crumbs by dying firelight? How many reports of hardship had he dismissed as the natural cost of drought, never imagining the hollow-eyed children who paid that price? In his mind he could see the faces waiting for him at Ironhold. Eriksson the Bold, his greatest champion, whose loyalty was absolute but whose understanding extended only to the edge of his sword. The man would be pacing the battlements by now, growling about kings who wandered unguarded while enemies gathered strength. Eriksson lived for the clarity of battle, the simple mathematics of victory and defeat. What would he make of a king who stood paralyzed by a starving woman's kindness? Then there was Sigrid, his sister, whose sharp mind had helped him navigate the treacherous politics of the northern clans. She managed his household, arranged his marriages to secure alliances, and spoke harsh truths when his temper burned too hot. Sigrid understood power's necessities, that kings who showed weakness invited challengers, that mercy was a luxury kingdoms could rarely afford. She would call this wandering among his subjects a dangerous indulgence, a crack in the armor of authority that protected them all. And what of Ulf the Wise, his eldest advisor, whose weathered hands had guided 3 generations of kings? The old man's counsel had steered Ragnar through famines before, always with the same cold logic: save the strong, the useful, the loyal. Let the weak fall like autumn leaves, and the kingdom would endure. Ulf had taught him that a king's first duty was to the throne itself, not to those who could offer nothing in return. The bread's heat intensified, and Ragnar found himself remembering another kind of warmth. The fever-bright eyes of his young son Magnus, dead these 3 years from the wasting sickness. No amount of gold or grain had saved the boy. No conquered territory had filled the hollow space his death left behind. In his final days, Magnus had spoken of wanting to see the common folk, to understand what lay beyond the fortress walls. Ragnar had promised they would ride together through the kingdom when the boy grew stronger. That promise haunted him now like an unpaid debt to the dead. The king's life awaited him. Negotiations with rival jarls who tested his strength like wolves circling wounded prey, decisions about which villages received aid and which were sacrificed to preserve resources for his warriors. There would be marriage proposals from ambitious fathers seeking alliances, each presented with smiles that masked calculated hunger for power. The spring raids were already planned, ships prepared to carry his men across storm-tossed seas to claim wealth from southern kingdoms while his own people withered. It was a life built on certainties he no longer questioned, that strength demanded hardness, that kingdoms survived through conquest, that kings could not afford the luxury of ordinary human feeling. For 20 years, those certainties had served him well, expanding his territory and filling his treasure vaults. Yet here, in this dying forest, holding bread that burned with impossible heat, Those certainties crumbled like ancient parchment. When had he last felt wonder at anything beyond the skill of his weaponsmiths or the efficiency of his spy networks? When had anyone last looked at him with something other than fear, ambition, or calculation? Astrid's words echoed in his memory. Let someone who has remembered love feed you, just this once. As if love were something that could be forgotten, mislaid like a sword set aside after battle, as if he had once known its weight and warmth before the cold mathematics of kingship taught him to measure every gesture's cost. The bread pulsed again, and with it came a terrible recognition. He stood at a crossroads between the man he had been and the king he had become. Behind him lay the certainty of his throne, the weight of expectations, the familiar burden of choices made with steel and gold. Ahead lay mystery wrapped in starlight eyes and impossible generosity. And for the first time in decades, Ragnar Ironwolf was afraid. Not of enemies or death, but of the answer to a question he dared not ask. What if everything he had built was founded on a lie? The bread began to glow. Not the subtle warmth Ragnar had felt before, but actual light, pale as moonbeams, bright as starfire. He stared in shock as the crust in his hands pulsed with silver radiance that cast dancing shadows across the dying trees. The light grew stronger with each heartbeat until the entire clearing bathed in ethereal luminescence that seemed to come from within the simple loaf itself. Impossible, he whispered. But even as the word left his lips, the forest around him began to change. Where moments before only skeletal branches had clawed at the darkening sky, leaves now unfurled like green flames. Flowers bloomed and fast forward across the barren ground. Wild roses, mountain lilies, herbs whose names he had forgotten since childhood. The air itself grew thick with the scent of spring rain and new growth, though no clouds gathered overhead. Grass sprouted beneath his feet, soft as silk, vibrant as emeralds. The makeshift shelter where Astrid had vanished with her children now stood transformed. What had been fallen branches and tattered cloth became a dwelling of white stone and silver timber, its walls inscribed with runes that shifted and flowed like living things. Light streamed from its windows, not the harsh glare of torches, but something warmer, more alive. Music drifted from within, hauntingly beautiful melodies that made his warrior's heart ache with longing for things he could not name. And there, in the doorway, stood Astrid. But not the starving woman who had offered him bread. This figure towered 7 feet tall, her frame no longer skeletal but magnificent, draped in robes that shimmered between silver and gold. Her hair flowed like liquid starlight, and her eyes, those same compassionate eyes, now blazed with the power of distant suns. Ancient wisdom radiated from her like heat from a forge, and when she smiled, Ragnar felt his knees threaten to buckle. "Do you understand now, King Ragnar Ironwolf?" Her voice carried harmonics that resonated in his bones, in his soul. "Do you see what your choice has awakened?" The words hit him like a physical blow. She knew, had always known. The disguise, the false name, the careful deception, all of it meaningless before whatever force stood before him now. But how could she be? "You are no mortal woman," he breathed, and it was not a question. "I am Astrid the compassionate, daughter of the ancient earth, keeper of the sacred tests." She stepped toward him, and with each footfall flowers bloomed. "For 7 seasons I have walked among the kingdoms of Midgard, taking the form of the desperate and dying. I have sought the hearts of rulers, testing what manner of souls command the fate of mortals." The bread in his hands blazed brighter, and suddenly Ragnar could see, truly see, what surrounded them. The transformed grove was not alone. Similar circles of divine light dotted the landscape like stars fallen to earth, each one marking a place where gods walked among men. And in every direction, he sensed other rulers facing their own moments of choosing, their own divine tests. "How many?" he whispered. 7 kings, 3 queens, a dozen jarls and chieftains, all who hold power over the innocent. Her expression grew sorrowful. "Most have already failed. They saw only a beggar's outstretched hand and turned away. They calculated the cost of charity and found it too high. They chose the safety of their hoarded grain over the risk of compassion. The implications crashed over him like a tsunami. This was no random encounter, no simple test of character. This was judgment, divine judgment upon all who ruled in this age of suffering. And he, by accepting bread from a starving woman, had somehow passed where others had failed. But why? The question tore from his throat. I am no saint. My hands are stained with blood. I have conquered and burned and taken what I wanted without thought for those who suffered. Why was my choice different? Astrid's smile was radiant, terrible, beautiful. Because in that moment, faced with true sacrifice freely given, you remembered. You felt wonder. You recognized something greater than yourself and chose to receive it with humility rather than suspicion. She gestured to the glowing bread. That choice has consequences, Ragnar Ironwolf. Consequences that will reshape not just your kingdom, but all the lands of Midgard. Terror and exhilaration warred in his chest. Around them, reality itself seemed to bend and flow like water, revealing glimpses of possible futures. Kingdoms transformed, wars ending, abundance flowing like rivers across drought-stricken lands. But also images of destruction, of gods withdrawing their favor from a world that had forgotten compassion. What must I choose? He asked, though he already sensed the magnitude of what awaited. Between the king you have been and the ruler you could become. Between the throne built on conquest and a crown earned through service. Her eyes blazed brighter. But know this, once you taste the bread of divine testing, there is no return to ignorance. The gods have awakened, and they will not sleep again until the fate of all kingdoms is decided. The bread pulsed in his hands, waiting. The bread blazed in his hands like captured starfire, but Ragnar found himself frozen, unable to lift it to his lips. The weight of Astrid's words crashed over him in waves, each revelation more terrifying than the last. Once you taste the bread of divine testing, there is no return to ignorance, no return. The phrase echoed in his mind like a death knell. His hands trembled, hands that had never shaken while gripping a sword, that had remained steady through countless battles and the weight of impossible decisions. Now they quaked like those of a green boy facing his first raid. The glowing bread seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment, as if it contained the weight of all possible worlds. You speak of transformation, he said, his voice hoarse. But what of the kingdom I leave behind? What of the warriors who have sworn their lives to me? Astrid's divine radiance pulsed gently, but her expression remained serene, offering no comfort for his torment. Tell me, king of the northern clans, what manner of kingdom will you leave them if you choose the path of ignorance? What legacy does a ruler build when he turns away from the divine tests? The question cut deep because he already knew the answer. In those glimpses of possible futures, he had seen what awaited kingdoms whose rulers failed this test. Drought eternal, lands turned to dust, the very gods withdrawing their favor until nothing remained but ash and memory. The other rulers, those who had turned away from divine compassion, their realms would wither like fruit left too long in the sun, but knowledge of their fate did nothing to ease his terror. Captain Bjorn's face rose in his mind, scarred, loyal, uncompromising in his devotion. The man had followed Ragnar into 30 battles, had taken wounds meant for his king, had never questioned an order in 15 years of service. What would he make of a ruler transformed by divine intervention? How could a simple warrior understand that his king had been chosen for something beyond the reach of sword and shield? My warriors follow strength, Ragnar whispered, more to himself than to the goddess before him. They understand victory and defeat, honor and shame. They pledge themselves to the Iron Wolf, not to whatever I might become. The bread's light pulsed, and he saw flashes of his great hall, the massive table where his closest companions gathered, the walls hung with the weapons of conquered enemies, the throne carved from the mast of the first ship he had ever captured. Eriksson would be there now, probably drunk on victory ale, boasting of their next raid. Ulf the Wise would be hunched over his scrolls, calculating grain stores and tribute payments with the cold precision that had kept their kingdom fed through hard winters. They had built something together, these rough men with their simple certainties. A kingdom that protected its own, that took what it needed from those too weak to hold it. It was harsh, perhaps, but it was theirs. Forged in battle, sealed with blood oaths, sustained by the kind of loyalty that asked no questions and demanded no explanations beyond the point of a spear. How could he return to them changed? How could he look Eriksson in the eye and speak of divine compassion when the man's own family had been murdered by raiders much like themselves? How could he counsel mercy to warriors whose very survival depended on their willingness to show none? "They will call it weakness," he said, and the words tasted bitter. "Divine mandate or not, they will see only a king who has forgotten the iron in his blood. And does their judgment matter more than the fate of every innocent soul in your realm?" Astrid's voice carried no condemnation, only infinite patience. But that somehow made it worse, because she was right, and he knew it. In his 7 days of wandering, he had seen the true cost of his kingdom's strength. Children who would never grow to take up sword or loom because they starved in silence while his warriors feasted. Families torn apart as they fled lands turned barren by cosmic displeasure. Villages emptied not by enemy raids, but by the slow death of hope itself. The bread burned against his palms, and suddenly he could feel them. Every hungry child, every desperate parent, every soul in his kingdom who suffered while he wrestled with fear of judgment from men who had never been asked to choose between the human and the divine. Yet still, he hesitated. Because beyond his warrior's potential betrayal lay an even deeper terror. What if he proved unworthy of the transformation itself? What if the divine power coursing through this simple bread revealed him to be exactly what his enemies claimed? A brutal king whose only true skill lay in the taking of life. What if the gods had made some cosmic mistake, choosing him when they meant to select someone pure, someone whose hands were clean of innocent blood? The weight of 20 years' worth of harsh decisions pressed down upon him. Villages burned in strategic retreats, surrendering enemies executed to send messages, alliances forged through arranged marriages that treated daughters like trade goods. Every choice had seemed necessary at the time, justified by the cold mathematics of survival. But how would they appear in the blazing light of divine judgment? The bread waited, patient as starlight, terrible as truth. Ragnar stared at the blazing bread, his mind spinning through every possible excuse, every reason to set it down and walk away. The transformed grove pulsed with divine energy around him, but all he could think of was retreat, back to the familiar weight of his crown, back to decisions made with steel instead of faith. Then Astrid spoke, her voice soft as falling snow. "What troubles you most, King of Iron? That your warriors might abandon you, or that you might finally become worthy of their loyalty?" The question hit him like a blade between the ribs. He opened his mouth to deny it, to claim his fears were purely practical, but the words died unspoken. Because she was right. Beneath all his terror of political consequences and divine judgment lay a deeper, more shameful fear that transformation might reveal how far he had fallen from the man he had once dreamed of becoming. He remembered that younger self, the prince who had sworn to be different from his father, who had promised to rule with both strength and wisdom. When had those dreams curdled into the bitter pragmatism that now governed his every choice? When had he last made a decision based on hope rather than fear? The bread blazed brighter, and memories flooded through him with painful clarity. His first execution, a captured raider barely older than himself, begging for mercy while his advisors counseled that weakness invited further attacks. The weight of the sword in his hands, the way the man's eyes had gone dark, the cheers of his warriors echoing hollow in his ears. How easily he had convinced himself it was necessity. How quickly necessity had become habit. "I have forgotten how to be anything but a weapon," he whispered, the admission torn from somewhere deep in his chest. "For 20 years, every choice has been about survival. Mine, my kingdoms, my peoples. I have made myself into iron because iron does not bend, does not break, does not doubt." His voice cracked. "But iron does not heal either. It only cuts." Astrid stepped closer, her radiance washing over him like warm sunlight. "And yet here you stand, offered the chance to remember what lies beneath the iron. The question is not whether you are worthy. The gods do not test those incapable of transformation. The question is whether you have the courage to release your grip on certainties that no longer serve. The words resonated through him like a bell tolling. Around them, the transformed grove seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Even the impossible flowers swaying in the divine breeze stilled, as if all of creation focused on this single moment of choosing. Ragnar thought of Magnus, his lost son, who had died while Ragnar wrestled with enemies and counted gold. He thought of Astrid as she had first appeared, skeletal, desperate, yet still willing to share her family's last hope with a stranger. He thought of every hollow-eyed face he had encountered in his wandering, every parent who watched their children fade while he debated the political wisdom of mercy. How many more would suffer while he clung to the safety of his iron crown? How many would die while he chose the familiar weight of conquest over the uncertain path of transformation? The drought that ravaged his lands was no natural disaster. It was divine displeasure with rulers who had forgotten their true purpose, and the cure blazed in his hands, demanding only that he find the courage to accept it. The clearing around him pulsed with otherworldly light, and suddenly he could sense them, his warriors, his advisors, his entire kingdom, as if they were all connected by invisible threads. But more than that, he could feel the other realms across Midgard, the kingdoms whose rulers had already faced this test and failed. Their lands grew more barren with each passing day, their people more desperate, as the gods withdrew their favor from those who chose power over compassion. He was perhaps the last, the final ruler to face divine judgment. If he turned away now, if he chose the safety of his old certainties, then all of Midgard might fall to eternal drought and divine abandonment. Not just his own people, but every innocent soul across the northern kingdoms would pay the price for his cowardice. The weight of that responsibility crashed over him like an avalanche, but strangely, it brought clarity rather than paralysis. This was no longer about his fears or his kingdom's political stability. This was about the survival of everything he had ever sworn to protect. "No more iron," he whispered, and felt something fundamental shift in his chest. The tight bands of control he had wrapped around his heart for 20 years began to loosen. No more choosing fear over faith. Before doubt could reclaim him, before the familiar voice of caution could whisper new reasons to hesitate, Ragnar Ironwolf lifted the blazing bread to his lips. The moment it touched his tongue, light exploded through his vision, and he felt his old life, his old self, burning away like morning mist before the sun. There was no path back to ignorance now, only forward into whatever he was meant to become. The bread dissolved on his tongue like liquid starfire, flooding his body with sensations beyond anything mortal flesh was meant to endure. Lightning coursed through his veins, his bones sang with harmonies older than kingdoms, and for a terrifying instant, Ragnar felt his very identity scatter like leaves before a divine storm. Then, just as suddenly, the chaos settled into something new, a profound awareness that stretched far beyond the boundaries of his own skin. He could feel the pulse of every living thing within leagues, the desperate heartbeat of a mother nursing her starving child, the slow, patient growth of seeds buried deep in drought-hardened earth, the mournful songs of rivers that remembered when they ran full and clear. But with expanded awareness came expanded pain. The suffering of his people, all people across Midgard, crashed over him in waves that left him gasping. This was the price of divine sight, to feel every hurt as if it were his own, to carry the weight of collective anguish without the protective barrier of ignorance. "Now you understand," Astrid said, though her voice seemed to come from both beside him and within his own thoughts. "This is the burden every true ruler must bear, to feel what their people feel, to carry their pain as well as their hope." Ragnar struggled to his feet, the transformed grove spinning around him as his consciousness adjusted to its new boundaries. The blazing light that had surrounded the goddess now emanated from his own skin, though fainter, like moonlight compared to her solar radiance. "What have you made me?" he whispered, staring at his hands as divine energy pulsed beneath the flesh. "What you chose to become, a king who rules not through fear, but through connection." Astrid gestured toward the horizon, where other points of light flickered in the distance, other places where gods walked among mortals, testing hearts and souls. But your transformation awakens forces that have slumbered for generations. There are those who will seek to destroy what you have become. As if summoned by her words, shadows began gathering at the edge of the grove, not natural darkness, but something older and hungrier. The divine light that bathed the transformed clearing seemed to recoil from these approaching forms, and the impossible flowers wilted wherever the shadows touched. "The Devourers," Astrid said, her voice carrying the first note of urgency Ragnar had heard. "They feed on despair, on the suffering that grows when rulers choose power over compassion. Your acceptance of divine purpose threatens their very existence." The shadows coalesced into vaguely human shapes, tall figures draped in tattered cloth that might once have been royal garments. Their faces were holes in reality itself, and where they walked, the earth cracked and bled. Ragnar counted 7 of them, moving with predatory grace toward the grove's perimeter. "The failed kings," he breathed, understanding flooding through his transformed consciousness. The rulers who chose wrong. Not merely failed, consumed by their own darkness until nothing remained but hunger and rage. Astrid's form began to shift, divine power gathering around her like storm clouds. They cannot bear to see another succeed where they fell to temptation. They will try to drag you down with them, to prove that compassion is weakness, that only cruelty can survive. The lead shadow raised what might have been a hand, and Ragnar felt cold fingers probe at the edges of his mind. Whispers followed, seductive, familiar voices speaking truths wrapped in poison. "You think divine power makes you strong? It makes you vulnerable. Your warriors will see the change in you and know you for what you've become, soft, weak, infected with mercy like a disease. Look at us, Brother King. We too accepted divine tests in our own ways. We opened our hearts to power beyond mortal comprehension, and see how it served us. Cast down, forgotten, transformed into warnings for fools like you. The bread you swallowed burns with false promises. Divine favor is just another chain, heavier than iron and twice as cruel. Join us willingly, and we'll show you the freedom that comes with embracing the darkness you've always carried." Ragnar staggered as the psychic assault intensified, each whisper finding purchase in his deepest fears. The divine light within him flickered, and he felt the terrible pull of their logic. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps transformation was just another trap, dressed in prettier lies than the ones he'd told himself as a conqueror. But then Astrid's hand touched his shoulder, and warmth blazed through him. Not the burning heat of divine power, but something gentler and infinitely stronger. The memory of her as she had first appeared, skeletal, desperate, yet still willing to share her family's last hope with a stranger. That act of impossible generosity, repeated now in ways both small and magnificent by countless souls across his transformed awareness. "You are not alone in this," she said, and suddenly the grove filled with new light, not divine radiance, but the warm glow of mortal hearts choosing compassion despite their fear. Other figures emerged from the forest beyond, a grizzled warrior with kind eyes, a wise woman whose hands bore the scars of healing work, a young skald whose songs carried more truth than any royal proclamation. "Your allies gather, King Ragnar," Astrid said, as the devourers howled their rage at the approaching help. "Those who recognize that true strength flows not from domination, but from the courage to serve something greater than oneself." The final test was beginning. The approaching figures moved through the moonlit forest with purpose that made Ragnar's transformed senses thrum with recognition. These were not the hollow shells of the devourers, but living souls who had somehow found their way to this sacred grove at the moment of greatest need. Yet as they drew closer, the divine light pulsing within him revealed truths that sent ice through his veins. The grizzled warrior bore scars Ragnar knew intimately, burn marks from the siege of Ironhold, a twisted left arm that had never healed properly after their battle against the southern reavers. This was Tormund the Faithful, his own shield brother, who had vanished 3 moons past during a scouting mission that Ragnar had deemed expendable. "My king," Tormund said, his weathered face creased with something between joy and sorrow. "I have been searching for you." "Impossible," Ragnar breathed. "You died. We found your helm by the Whispering Falls, bloodied and broken." The old warrior's smile carried infinite sadness. "Death is not what we believed it to be. When the gods began their testing, when the boundaries between realms grew thin, some of us were recalled, given choice." He gestured to the divine energy crackling around Ragnar's form, "to stand with those who might yet save what we could not." The wise woman stepped forward next, and Ragnar's heart nearly shattered. Grandmother Sigrid, the healer who had tended his childhood wounds, who had died in the plague that swept their lands 5 winters past. Her hand still bore the herb stains he remembered, but now they glowed with soft silver light. "The question," she said in the voice that had sung him to sleep through countless nightmares, "is whether you can accept help from those you failed to protect." The weight of her words struck him like physical blows. These were not merely allies, they were the spirits of those whose deaths lay heavy on his conscience. Tormund, sent on a mission Ragnar knew was suicide but necessary for the kingdom's security. Sigrid, who had perished because he had diverted resources from healing supplies to weapon forging. The young skald, gods preserve him, was Eric, barely 16, who had died in Ragnar's first raid as king because the boy had begged to come along, and Ragnar had been too proud to refuse. "You gather the dead to fight beside you," he whispered to Astrid. "Is this divine justice or divine cruelty?" "It is choice," she replied, her radiance pulsing with the rhythm of his racing heart. They could have passed to their eternal rest. Instead, they chose to remain, to offer aid when the final moment came. The question is whether you will accept that their faith in you transcends even death. The devourers pressed closer to the grove's perimeter, their hollow voices rising in a chorus of condemnation. "See how the God-touched manipulates even the dead. This is what divine favor brings, the desecration of rest, the binding of souls to false hope. We offer release from such burdens." But Tormund was already drawing his spectral blade, its edge gleaming with the same light that flowed through Ragnar's transformed form. "I've heard enough from failed kings who blamed the gods for their own weakness." The air crackled with tension as both sides prepared for battle. Ragnar found himself caught between terror and desperate hope. Terror at facing enemies who had once been rulers like himself, hope at having allies whose loyalty transcended the grave itself. Yet underneath both emotions lay a deeper fear that gnawed at his resolve. "They know things," he said quietly to Astrid as the opposing forces began to circle each other like wolves. "The devourers. They speak of my warrior's loyalty, of political consequences I haven't considered. What if transformation makes me strong enough to defeat them here, but too changed to hold my kingdom when I return?" "Then you must decide," Astrid replied, "what matters more, keeping a throne or becoming worthy of it." Sigrid moved to his other side, her silver radiance interweaving with Astrid's golden glow. "Power that requires you to remain unchanged is not power at all, child. It is fear dressed in royal garments." The truth of it struck him like lightning, but before he could fully process the revelation, the lead devourer raised its shadow-wreathed arms. The temperature plummeted, and frost began spreading across the grove's transformed earth. Where the divine light touched the advancing ice, steam rose like the breath of giants. "Enough talk of worthiness and transformation," the creature hissed, its voice like grinding stone. "We offer demonstration. Feel what awaits those who trust divine promises over mortal strength." The shadow struck like a spear, aiming not for Ragnar's body but for his mind, for every doubt, every fear, every moment of weakness he had ever experienced. The psychic assault threatened to shatter his consciousness entirely, but he felt his spectral allies move to shield him, their own light blazing fierce and protective. The final battle was no longer approaching. It had begun. The psychic spear tore through Ragnar's consciousness like molten iron through flesh, bypassing every defense he had ever constructed. In an instant, the shadow weapon found its mark, the deepest chamber of his heart where his greatest terror lived, festering and unexamined for 20 years. Magnus. Suddenly he was no longer in the divine grove, but in the burning watchtower of Ironhold. 5 years passed. Smoke choked the air while enemy arrows whistled overhead, and his 15-year-old son lay dying in his arms. Blood frothed on the boy's lips as his eyes, so like Ragnar's own, dimmed with accusation. "You chose them over me," Magnus whispered, his voice carrying across time with supernatural clarity. "When the kingdom called, and I begged you to stay, you chose duty over love. You chose being a king over being a father." The memory twisted, became something worse than truth, became the fear that had poisoned every decision since. Around him, the devourer's assault intensified, feeding on the guilt that had driven him to ever greater acts of conquest, ever harsher displays of strength. Anything to prove he had been right to leave, that the boy's death meant something. "This is what divine transformation costs," the lead devourer crooned, its hollow voice echoing from within the nightmare. "You think compassion will make you strong? It will only multiply your failures. Every soul you fail to save will join the chorus of accusations. Every child who starves while you hesitate will become another Magnus, another wound that never heals." Ragnar felt himself breaking, the divine light within him flickering like a candle in a hurricane. The devourer was right. How could he trust himself with divine power when he had failed so catastrophically with mortal responsibility? How could he claim worthiness when his own son had died believing himself unloved? But then warmth blazed through the nightmare, not his own failing light, but something infinitely brighter. Astrid's presence wrapped around his shattered consciousness like protective flame, and suddenly Magnus's face changed. The accusation faded from his dying eyes, replaced by something Ragnar had been too guilt-blinded to see in the actual memory: understanding, forgiveness, love that transcended even death's approach. "I never blamed you," Magnus said, and now his voice carried the weight of divine truth rather than mortal fear. A boy's hurt feelings in the moment of parting are not a son's final judgment on his father's heart. You carry guilt that was never yours to bear. The nightmare shattered, and Ragnar found himself back in the grove with tears streaming down his face. The devourer's psychic spear recoiled as if burned, its wielder howling rage and confusion. "Impossible," it snarled. "Guilt is eternal. Failure is permanent. We are proof." "You are proof of nothing but your own refusal to heal," Tormund said, his spectral blade now blazing with silver fire. "I died because you sent me on a desperate mission, my king, but I chose to go. We all chose, always chose, to follow a ruler who shouldered burdens we could not carry alone. Sigrid's healing light pulsed stronger, and I died tending plague victims because that was my calling, not because you failed to provide enough supplies. Death comes to healers as it comes to warriors, in service to what we love." Young Eric stepped forward, his ghostly form shimmering with starlight. "Even I chose to ride with you despite your warnings. These shadows would have you believe that leadership means taking responsibility for every choice others make, every tragedy that strikes despite your efforts. But that is not justice. It is the madness that created them." The devourers circled tighter, their forms growing more solid as they fed on the emotional upheaval. But Ragnar could see them clearly now through his transformed awareness. Not failed kings, but kings who had failed to accept failure as part of the human condition. They had let guilt consume them until nothing remained but the hunger to prove their own worthlessness by dragging others down. "We offer you the truth of power," the lead shadow pressed, desperation creeping into its grinding voice. "Join us willingly, and never again feel the pain of caring for those you cannot save. Rule without the weakness of attachment, conquer without the burden of conscience." For a heartbeat, Ragnar felt the seductive pull of that offer. To cast aside the weight of divine transformation, to return to the simple certainties of iron rule. No more feeling his people's hunger as his own. No more carrying their hopes along with their pain. But Astrid's hand touched his shoulder, and through that contact flowed the memory of her gift. The last bread given freely despite desperate need. Not because she was certain of reward, but because compassion was worth the risk. "The choice is yours," she said softly. "Embrace the pain of caring, knowing you will sometimes fail but will always grow stronger in love. Or join those who chose the safety of emptiness over the courage of connection." Around them, the battle hung in perfect balance. His spectral allies blazed with protective light, while the devourers pressed their assault against the grove's sacred boundaries. Everything, his transformation, his kingdom, perhaps all of Midgard, waited on his decision. Ragnar Ironwolf raised his head and felt divine fire kindle in his eyes. The divine fire that blazed in Ragnar's eyes lasted exactly 3 heartbeats before it guttered and died. The sacred light that had pulsed through his veins like liquid starfire suddenly felt cold, distant, as if viewing the sun through winter ice. He staggered, one hand pressed to his chest where something vital was tearing loose. Not his heart, but the connection itself. The thread that had bound him to divine purpose was unraveling with sickening speed. "What?" he gasped, but Astrid's face had gone pale as moonlight, her golden radiance flickering like a candle in a storm. "The mortal realm calls you back," she whispered, and for the first time since their meeting, her voice carried the weight of genuine fear. "Your physical form. It cannot sustain the transformation at such distance from the source." Even as she spoke, Ragnar felt himself becoming translucent. Through his fading hands, he could see his spectral allies wavering like heat mirages. Tormund's silver blade was already half dissolved, the old warrior's form scattering on winds that existed between worlds. "My king," Tormund said, his voice echoing from an impossible distance. "We cannot hold—" The words cut off as Ragnar's shield brother vanished entirely, pulled back into whatever realm had briefly released him. Sigrid followed moments later, her healing light winking out like a snuffed flame. Young Eric lasted long enough to mouth a single word, "Remember," before he too dissolved into memory and starlight. "No." Ragnar lunged forward, trying to grasp what remained of his allies, but his hands passed through empty air. The divine grove itself was beginning to fade around them, impossible flowers wilting back into common weeds, the spring's crystal waters turning muddy brown. The devourers, however, remained solid as iron. If anything, they seemed to grow more substantial as the sacred energies departed, their hollow laughter echoing with triumph. "Did you think divine favor came without price?" the lead shadow hissed, advancing on unsteady legs. "The gods test mortal hearts, yes, but they do not break cosmic law to coddle their chosen. Your body lies 3 leagues from here, and it has been 7 hours since you accepted transformation. Flesh has limits that spirit does not." Ragnar's vision blurred as another wave of weakness crashed over him. He could feel it now, his physical form calling him back like a chain around his soul. His actual body, collapsed somewhere in the drought-stricken forest, was dying from the strain of channeling divine power beyond its capacity. Every moment he remained in this transformed state brought him closer to the threshold from which no king, divine or otherwise, could return. "Choose quickly," the devourer pressed, moving within striking distance. Its shadow blade materialized in what passed for hands, the weapon humming with anti-light that made Ragnar's remaining divine essence recoil. "Join us now while transition is still possible, or let your noble transformation burn your mortal shell to ash, leaving you neither god nor man, but simply another cautionary tale." Astrid's hand found his arm, but even her touch felt distant now, filtered through layers of cosmic interference. "There is another way," she said desperately. "Return to your body, accept the limitations of mortal flesh. You will lose the divine connection, but you will live to serve in smaller ways, to plant seeds of compassion that might grow across generations." "And abandon the kingdom to these creatures?" Ragnar gestured weakly toward the devourers, who were spreading out to surround the fading grove. "Without divine power, I'm just another failed king. They'll consume what's left of this sacred space, then move on to corrupt every heart I might have touched." The terrible irony struck him like a physical blow. By accepting divine transformation, he had doomed himself to failure more complete than any he might have achieved through mortal weakness alone. His own success had become the instrument of its destruction. Through their fading connection, He felt Astrid's anguish as keenly as his own. She had hoped, perhaps even believed, that mortal and divine could bridge the gap between their natures, that a king's heart properly awakened could channel enough divine power to heal the wounds carved by generations of cruel rule. Instead, they had proven the old warnings true. Gods and mortals existed in separate spheres for good reason. To cross between them invited not transformation but annihilation. 7 minutes, the lead devourer announced with ghastly satisfaction. That is how long your flesh can survive without your soul's return. We can smell it dying from here, the sweet stench of noble intentions rotting into cosmic waste. Ragnar closed his eyes, feeling tears track down his translucent cheeks. In trying to become worthy of divine trust, he had lost everything that might have made him useful to either realm. Too changed to be human, too mortal to remain divine. The gods' test hadn't revealed his worthiness. It had revealed the fundamental impossibility of bridging the gap between what he was and what the kingdom needed. Around him, the last of the sacred grove crumbled back into ordinary forest. His moment of divine purpose was ending not in triumph or noble sacrifice, but in the slow dissolution of everything he had dared to hope might be possible. The devourers raised their shadow blades and began their final approach. But as the shadow blades descended, something impossible happened within Ragnar's dissolving consciousness. The pain of his approaching death, not the clean agony of battle, but the slow unraveling of purpose itself, suddenly crystallized into perfect, terrible clarity. He was dying because he had accepted divine power while clinging to mortal understanding. The transformation had failed because he still thought like a king seeking to solve problems through strength, still believed that worthiness meant the power to save everyone. Even with godlight flowing through his veins, he had tried to be Ragnar Ironwolf the Conqueror, simply armed with better weapons. But that was not what Astrid had offered him in the forest clearing. The memory blazed through his fragmenting awareness with supernatural force, a starving woman giving her last bread to a stranger, not because she expected divine reward or even gratitude, but because compassion itself was worth more than survival. She had not calculated worthiness or measured outcomes. She had simply chosen love over fear in a moment when love seemed impossible. "I understand," he whispered, and his voice carried such conviction that even the devourers hesitated mid-strike. The revelation struck him like lightning splitting an ancient oak. Divine transformation was not meant to make him stronger. It was meant to make him smaller, not more capable of saving others, but more willing to be saved. The gods had not chosen him because he was worthy of power, but because he was ready to discover that true power lay in accepting powerlessness. Ragnar stopped fighting the dissolution. Instead of clinging to the fading divine energy, he opened himself completely to the experience of failure. Let himself feel, without reservation or self-protection, the full weight of every soul he could not save, every wrong he could not right, every limitation that mortality placed upon even the noblest intentions. And in that moment of absolute surrender, something unprecedented occurred. The divine light that had been bleeding away from him reversed its flow, not returning to his body, but expanding outward in all directions. Where he had tried to contain godfire within mortal flesh, he now released it freely into the world around him. The failing connection became a gift, rather than a burden, divine essence flowing through him like water through cupped hands. The effect was immediate and startling. Instead of growing weaker as the light departed, Ragnar felt himself becoming more present, more real. His translucent form solidified, but not with divine radiance, with something far more profound. He was becoming entirely, authentically human for the first time in his adult life. The devourers recoiled as if burned, though no flame touched them. Their shadow weapons dissolved in their grasping hands as the released divine energy washed over them like gentle rain. But instead of destroying them, the light began revealing what lay beneath their corrupted forms. "No," the lead shadow moaned, its grinding voice cracking with unexpected emotion. "We chose emptiness. We chose safety. You cannot make us feel again." But Ragnar could see through their dissolving masks now, his transformed perception revealing the truth that even the devourers had forgotten. They were not failed kings consumed by guilt. They were kings who had never allowed themselves to fail, who had chosen the illusion of control over the vulnerability of genuine love. Their corruption came not from caring too much, but from caring too little, from treating their people as possessions, to be managed, rather than souls to be cherished. "You can choose again," he said, extending his hand toward the nearest shadow. "Divine judgment is not punishment, it is invitation. Let yourself feel the pain you have been fleeing. Let yourself grieve for what your kingdoms lost when you chose power over connection." The devourer stared at his offered hand with something approaching terror. To accept would mean abandoning the cold certainty of emptiness, returning to the frightening world where leaders could love their people and still watch them suffer, where caring deeply offered no guarantee of saving anyone. Around them, the forest itself was transforming, not into the impossible perfection of the divine grove, but into something far more precious. The drought-withered trees remained parched, the cracked earth stayed barren, but now there was hope, threaded through the desolation like golden wire. The land still suffered, but it suffered with purpose, with the promise that even in the darkest season, compassion could take root and grow. Astrid moved to stand beside him, her radiance now gentle rather than blazing. "This is what we hoped you might discover," she said softly. "Not how to wield divine power, but how to release it. Not how to become more than human, but how to become fully human at last." Ragnar felt tears streaming down his face, mortal tears, salty and warm and precious beyond measure. The cosmic weight that had nearly destroyed him was gone, replaced by something infinitely lighter and infinitely more real, the simple, revolutionary choice to love his people not because he could save them, but because they deserved to be loved. The first of the devourers lowered its shadow blade and reached, trembling, toward his extended hand. The moment the shadow touched Ragnar's outstretched palm, transformation rippled through both beings like stones cast into still water. The devourer's form shuddered, darkness bleeding away in wisps to reveal something achingly familiar, a man perhaps Ragnar's own age, wearing the tattered remnants of royal furs. His face bore the hollow look of someone who had forgotten how to weep. "I was King Halvard of the Eastern Reaches," the man whispered, his voice raw with centuries of suppressed grief. "My people starved during the great winter, and I could not bear to see their accusation in every dying face. So I stopped looking, stopped feeling, told myself that cold efficiency was mercy." More shadows were reaching forward now, their forms wavering between corruption and remembrance. As each one grasped Ragnar's hand or touched his shoulder, the divine light he had released continued its gentle work of revelation, not burning away their darkness, but illuminating the human hearts that still beat beneath layers of chosen numbness. A woman emerged from dissolving shadow, her spectral crown marking her as royalty. "Queen Valdis of the Southern Fjords. I let my warriors die in pointless raids rather than admit I had been wrong to start the war. It seemed easier than facing their widows." Another figure materialized, then another. King after king, queen after queen, rulers who had chosen the terrible safety of emotional death over the vulnerable courage of continued caring. They stood in the transformed grove like patients awakening from a fever dream, blinking in wonder at sensations they had forgotten existed. But Ragnar felt something else stirring in the space between worlds, a presence vast and ancient, watching with approval as the divine energy he had released began to coalesce into something unprecedented. The light was not dissipating into nothingness. Instead, it was weaving itself into the very fabric of the forest, the earth, the air itself. "Do you see?" Astrid's voice carried notes of joy and amazement even she had not expected. "By releasing divine power instead of hoarding it, you have created something new. A sanctuary not just for the living, but for all who have lost their way in the labyrinth of leadership." Around them, the drought-stricken forest was indeed changing, but slowly, naturally. New shoots pushed through cracked earth, not through divine miracle, but through the patient work of seeds that had been waiting for the right conditions. The transformation Ragnar had released was not remaking the world according to his will. It was simply removing the barriers that had prevented natural healing from taking root. King Halvard looked down at his hands as if seeing them for the first time in centuries. "The pain," he said wonderingly. "I thought it would destroy me if I let it return, but it is bearable, necessary even." "Pain shared is pain halved," Ragnar found himself saying, the words rising from some deep well of understanding. "We were never meant to carry these burdens alone. That was our first mistake, believing that kingship meant shouldering responsibility without sharing the weight." More figures were emerging from the spaces between shadow and starlight, but these were different. Ragnar recognized the faces of common folk from his own kingdom, farmers who had died in the drought, children who had succumbed to hunger, warriors who had fallen in battles they barely understood. They appeared not as accusers, but as witnesses to something miraculous, the moment when their king finally learned to grieve for them properly. "We do not need you to save us," said a woman Ragnar remembered from his wanderings, a mother who had lost 3 children to the famine. "We need you to honor what our lives meant, to let our suffering teach rather than torment you, to build something better from the lessons written in our graves." The redeemed kings began to fade, but peacefully now, their forms dissolving into gentle light rather than desperate shadow. As they departed, each one offered Ragnar something precious, not power or wisdom, but simple recognition. The acknowledgement that he was no longer walking the path of leadership alone. "We will remember," Queen Valdis said, as her form grew translucent. "And when other rulers lose their way, as all rulers must, we will be here to help them find the path between tyranny and abdication, the middle way that leads through the heart." Astrid placed her hand over Ragnar's heart, and he felt something settle there, not divine power, but divine permission. Permission to be imperfect, to fail, to try again. Permission to love without controlling, to lead without dominating, to serve without sacrificing his own humanity on the altar of others' expectations. "Your kingdom awaits," she said softly. "Not a god returning with divine solutions, but a king who has learned the difference between strength and force, between wisdom and certainty. They will not thank you for becoming what they need instead of what they want. But you will sleep peacefully, knowing you chose connection over control." Ragnar nodded, understanding flooding through him like sunrise after the longest night. His people deserved not a perfect king, but a genuine one. The drought would end when it ended, through mortal effort and natural cycles, not divine intervention, but it would end with them still human, still capable of growth, still worthy of love. The true work could finally begin. The grove faded around them like morning mist, leaving Ragnar standing alone in the drought-stricken forest where his journey had begun. But everything had changed, including himself. The divine radiance was gone from his form, yet he felt more substantial than he had in years, not diminished by mortality, but completed by it. His physical body lay crumpled against the base of an ancient oak, exactly as the devourers had warned. 7 hours of separation had taken their toll. His flesh was pale, breathing shallow, but alive. As his consciousness settled back into mortal form, pain flooded through him. Not the cosmic agony of divine transformation, but the simple, honest discomfort of a middle-aged king who had pushed himself beyond endurance. He welcomed it. Every ache was proof of his humanity, every limitation a reminder that his strength lay not in transcending mortal boundaries, but in working within them. Ragnar struggled to his feet, muscles protesting after hours of abandonment. The forest around him still bore the scars of drought, withered leaves, cracked earth, streams reduced to muddy trickles, yet something fundamental had shifted. Where once he had seen only problems requiring his intervention, he now perceived a landscape in transition. Seeds waited in the hardened soil. Root systems had grown deeper, stronger during the dry season. Life persisted with patience he was only beginning to understand. The journey back to his kingdom would take 3 days on foot. 3 days to prepare for the most difficult conversation of his reign. How did a king explain divine revelation to people who needed practical solutions? How did he translate the mystical truth of released power into policies that would actually help his starving subjects? But as he began walking, Ragnar realized he was approaching the question wrong. Again, He was still thinking like a ruler who needed to have all the answers before facing his people. The old habit of believing that kingship meant solving problems rather than sharing burdens. The true work ahead was not about implementing divine wisdom, but about admitting ignorance, about gathering his advisors, his nobles, even common farmers, and asking the question he had never dared voice: I have failed you. Will you help me learn how to do better? By midday, Ragnar encountered his first test. A group of refugees from the eastern settlements had made camp beside what remained of the Thornbrook River. Children with hollow eyes watched him approach, while their parents clutched makeshift weapons with the desperate readiness of those who had lost everything. The old Ragnar would have announced his identity, demanded their loyalty, promised solutions he could not deliver. This Ragnar simply knelt beside their dying fire and began gathering kindling from the forest floor. May I share your camp? He asked quietly. I have been traveling alone, and the road ahead is long. A grizzled man who seemed to be their leader studied him suspiciously. You're well fed for a wanderer. What do you offer in trade? Ragnar considered his answer carefully. What did he have to give that would not be condescension disguised as charity? Knowledge of game trails in the northern woods, strong hands for whatever work needs doing, and, he hesitated, then committed fully to vulnerability. Stories, if you're willing to listen. I have learned hard truths recently about the difference between leading and serving. The man's expression shifted slightly. Perhaps he heard something in Ragnar's voice that suggested genuine experience rather than empty platitudes. We could use another pair of hands. The little ones need shelter built before the rains come. For the rest of the day, Ragnar worked alongside the refugees without revealing his identity. He gathered stones for foundations, wove branches into windbreaks, shared his travel rations without ceremony. When evening came and they sat around the rebuilt fire, he told them carefully chosen portions of his story, a king's journey toward understanding what his people truly needed from their ruler. Power without compassion is tyranny, he said, watching sparks rise into the darkening sky. But compassion without effectiveness is just another form of abandonment. The challenge is finding the balance. An elderly woman nodded thoughtfully. My father served 3 kings before this current one. Said the best ruler he ever knew was the one who asked the most questions instead of giving the most orders. What questions? Ragnar asked, genuinely curious. What am I not seeing? Who have I not heard from? What am I afraid to admit? Simple words, but they kept him honest when the crown's weight started turning his head. Ragnar felt those questions settle into his heart alongside Astrid's gift of divine permission. This was how transformation really worked, not through cosmic revelation, but through the slow accumulation of mortal wisdom shared freely between souls who recognized their mutual need. When morning came, he helped the refugees pack their makeshift camp and pointed them towards settlements where they might find temporary shelter. Only as they prepared to part ways did the grizzled leader grasp his arm with sudden recognition. You're him, aren't you? King Ragnar. Ragnar met his eyes steadily. I am trying to learn how to be. The man nodded once, understanding passing between them like a completed circuit. Then may your journey teach you well, my lord. We will be waiting to see what kind of king returns to us. Ahead lay the capital, his court, the weight of a crown that felt entirely different now. The real work was about to begin. The capital's towers appeared through the morning haze like accusations written against the sky. Ragnar paused on the ridge overlooking his kingdom, seeing it truly for the first time, not as an extension of his will but as a living organism suffering from neglect disguised as strength. Below, the great hall where he had dispensed absolute justice stood dark against the dawn. The barracks where his warriors trained for endless campaigns spread like scars across what had once been fertile ground. The palace walls rose higher than any threat required, built not for protection but for the illusion of permanence that had cost him everything. His captain of guards, Eric Stormbreaker, waited at the main gate with a contingent of mounted warriors. They had been searching for their missing king for 8 days, and their relief at his appearance warred visibly with confusion at his changed demeanor. My lord, Eric dismounted hurriedly, his weathered face tight with concern. "The council has been in constant session. Lord Bjorn speaks of regency if you cannot be found. The people grow restless. The people grow hungry," Ragnar corrected quietly, accepting the reins of his offered horse. "There is a difference." Eric's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied his king's face. "You are changed. What happened in the deep woods?" Ragnar mounted slowly, feeling the familiar weight of kingship settling around him like armor that no longer fit properly. "I learned the difference between ruling and serving. We must convene the full court immediately, but not in the throne room." "Where then, my lord?" "The great hall. Remove the throne. Set a circle of chairs where all may sit as equals." Ragnar saw Eric's expression of barely concealed alarm and pressed on. "I know how it sounds. Do it anyway." The ride through his capital's streets confirmed his worst fears. The drought had not touched these walls equally. While common quarters showed signs of rationing and desperation, the noble district remained lush with imported luxuries. Gardens flourished with water diverted from public fountains. Children begged outside gates that protected granaries filled for private feasts. But instead of rage, Ragnar felt something more dangerous: understanding. He had created this inequality not through malice, but through the simple failure to see beyond the voices that reached his throne room. The wealthy had always had access to his ear. The poor had only had access to his laws. At the palace steps, his seneschal Magnus rushed forward with scrolls and urgent reports. "My lord, the eastern provinces report complete crop failure. The treasury cannot sustain another season of grain imports. Lord Bjorn demands we consider military action against the southern kingdoms. Their harvests remain strong while ours." "Magnus." Ragnar's voice carried a quiet authority that silenced the flow of crisis. "Send word to every village chief, every farm leader, every guild master. I require their presence at court within 3 days. Not their representatives. Them. But my lord, the logistics alone will be managed. Use the royal treasury for their travel expenses and lodging. Empty it if necessary." Ragnar met his seneschal's horrified stare. A king who cannot speak directly to his people is not a king. He is merely a man in an expensive chair making decisions about lives he has never lived. News of the unconventional royal summons spread through the kingdom like wildfire. By evening, riders were galloping toward every corner of the realm carrying invitations that read more like personal pleas than royal commands. Lords grumbled about protocol. Commoners stared at parchment they could barely read, wondering if the message could possibly be real. In his private chambers, Ragnar dismissed his servants and sat alone before a mirror that reflected a face he barely recognized. The divine radiance was gone, but something more precious had taken its place: the beginning of genuine humility. Tomorrow would bring the greatest test of his reign, admitting failure to the very people who had suffered for his mistakes. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. Eric entered without ceremony, carrying 2 cups of ale and the expression of a man preparing for difficult conversation. 20 years I have served you," the captain said, settling into a chair with familiar ease. "I have followed you into battles that seemed impossible, supported decisions that appeared mad. But this, Ragnar, what you're proposing, will destroy the foundations of royal authority. If you seat farmers and fishermen as equals to lords, then perhaps those foundations needed destroying." Ragnar accepted the offered cup, meeting his oldest friend's eyes. "Tell me, Eric, when did we stop fighting for our people and start fighting to maintain the right to rule them?" Eric was quiet for a long moment, staring into his ale. "The southern campaigns. When we conquered the river valleys and you had to choose between their traditions and ours. You said a king could not show weakness by admitting uncertainty. And look what strength has bought us. A kingdom divided, land dying while we debate territorial expansion, people starving while we feast." Ragnar drained his cup. "Divine judgment, Eric, is not lightning from heaven. It is the slow collapse that comes when leaders forget they are servants, not masters." Tomorrow, everything would change. The real work was about to begin. The dawn of the 3rd day broke gray and ominous, heavy clouds gathering like an army of the dispossessed above the capital. Ragnar stood at his chamber window, watching streams of common folk converge on the palace grounds. Farmers with dirt still under their fingernails, fishermen reeking of the sea, craftsmen carrying the honest calluses of their trades. They moved uncertainly through gates that had never welcomed their kind, past guards who watched with barely concealed suspicion. In the courtyard below, a more dangerous gathering was taking shape. Lord Bjorn Ironhand stood at the center of a cluster of nobles, his voice carrying clearly through the morning air despite his attempt at discretion. Madness that threatens everything our fathers built. A king who abandons his throne room for common rabble abandons the divine right that legitimizes his rule. Enough. Ragnar's voice cut across the space like a blade. He had descended without fanfare, wearing simple leather rather than royal regalia. The assembled nobles turned toward him with expressions ranging from concern to barely veiled hostility. Lord Bjorn stepped forward, his hand resting meaningfully on his sword hilt. "My Lord King, as your most loyal vassal, I must speak plainly. This gathering violates every precedent of proper governance. To seat farmers as equals to lords is to invite chaos into the very heart of our realm." "And what has our proper governance achieved, Bjorn?" Ragnar asked quietly. "Prosperity for the few while the many starve? Strength that exists only as long as we can ignore the suffering it creates?" "It has achieved order." Bjorn's voice rose, and several other lords murmured agreement. "The natural hierarchy that keeps civilization from collapsing into barbarism. Would you see noble bloodlines bow to the whims of peasants who understand nothing of statecraft?" Ragnar felt the old familiar pull, the temptation to assert dominance through force, to remind these challengers of his power through demonstration rather than discourse. The warrior king he had been for 20 years tensed within him, ready to crush this rebellion before it could spread. But another voice spoke in his memory: "Pain shared is pain halved. We were never meant to carry these burdens alone." "I would see noble bloodlines remember what made them noble in the first place," Ragnar replied, his tone remaining steady despite the tension crackling through the air. "Service to something greater than themselves. Protection of those who cannot protect themselves. The courage to admit when their methods have failed." "Failed?" Lord Magnus Goldbeard stepped forward, his face flushed with indignation. "We have expanded the kingdom's borders, filled the royal treasury, maintained peace through strength, while our people starve." Ragnar's words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of uncomfortable silence. "While the land itself dies from neglect, while we debate territorial expansion as children beg at our gates." He gestured toward the gathering crowd of commoners. "Look at them, Magnus. Really look. These are not subjects to be managed. They are the kingdom itself, the hands that grow our food, the backs that bear our burdens, the hearts that beat with loyalty we have not earned." Lord Bjorn's hand tightened on his sword. "Pretty words, but words do not govern kingdoms. Strength governs kingdoms, order governs kingdoms. And if you lack the will to maintain both, are you challenging my authority, Bjorn?" The question hung in the air like a drawn blade. Around them, conversations died as nobles and commoners alike sensed the shift toward violence. This was the moment Ragnar had known would come, the inevitable confrontation between the king he had been and the king he was trying to become. But instead of the expected explosion of royal wrath, something unprecedented happened. Ragnar stepped closer to Bjorn, close enough that only the Lord could hear his next words. "You are afraid," Ragnar said quietly. "Afraid that if we change how we rule, you will lose everything you have built your identity around. I understand that fear, Bjorn, because I have felt it myself. But consider this. What if clinging to the old ways costs us not just our power, but our souls?" Lord Bjorn's face went white, then red. "You speak of souls while the kingdom crumbles. While enemies gather at our borders, while the treasury empties, while chaos spreads, you offer them philosophy. I offer them truth." Ragnar's voice carried now across the entire courtyard, reaching nobles and commoners alike. The truth that a king who rules through fear rules over nothing but ghosts. The truth that strength without wisdom is just another form of weakness. And the truth that 20 years of absolute authority have taught me nothing compared to 3 days of actually listening to the people I swore to serve. The confrontation had reached its apex. In the charged silence that followed, every person present understood that more than royal policy hung in the balance. The very nature of kingship itself was being decided in this moment, with no gods to guide them, only mortal will, mortal wisdom, and mortal courage to choose connection over control. The real test of transformation was about to begin. The moment stretched taut as a bowstring, and in that silence, Ragnar felt the weight of 20 years of kingship crystallize into a single inescapable choice. Lord Bjorn's hand had moved fully to his sword now, and behind him, a dozen noble lords shifted into positions that spoke of long-planned rebellion. The commoners pressed closer, sensing the danger but unwilling to flee, their weathered faces showing the desperate hope of people who had traveled days for this one chance to be heard. "Then you force my hand," Bjorn declared, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "By the ancient laws, I invoke the right of noble challenge. A king who abandons the divine order of rule has abandoned his right to the crown." Eric Stormbreaker moved immediately to Ragnar's side, his own blade half drawn, but Ragnar raised a hand to stop him. The gesture cost him everything. In that moment of staying his most loyal defender's sword, he felt the last vestige of his old kingship crack apart like ice in spring. "No, Eric." The words came quietly, but they carried the finality of avalanche. "This ends here, but not through bloodshed." The captain's eyes widened in horror. "My lord, you cannot mean to—" "I renounce the crown." The words fell into the courtyard like stones into a deep well, creating ripples of shock that spread through nobles and commoners alike. Lord Bjorn's sword froze half-drawn, his face twisting with confusion rather than triumph. This was not the outcome he had planned. A deposed king could become a martyr, but one who abdicated freely? "I renounce the crown," Ragnar repeated, his voice growing stronger. 20 years I have worn it, and 20 years I have failed to understand its true weight. A crown is not a prize to be seized or a burden to be borne in isolation. It is a trust, a sacred compact between ruler and ruled that I have broken through my blindness. He turned slowly, addressing the entire gathering. "You speak truly, Bjorn. A king who abandons the divine order has no right to rule, but the divine order is not what we believed it to be. It is not the strong commanding the weak, the noble crushing the common, the few deciding the fate of the many. The divine order is this." He gestured toward the crowd of farmers and fishermen, artisans and herders. "The willingness to serve something greater than ourselves. The courage to admit ignorance and seek wisdom from those we claim to protect." Eric's voice cracked like a man watching his world end. "Ragnar, without the crown you are nothing, just another landless warrior in a realm that will tear itself apart without strong rule." "Good." The word came with surprising peace. "Let me be nothing. Let me be what I should have been from the beginning, a man who serves rather than commands, who listens rather than pronounces, who builds rather than conquers." But as he spoke these words, Ragnar felt the true cost of his choice settling into his bones. The crown was not just authority, it was identity, purpose, the meaning that had shaped every day of his adult life. Without it, he was indeed nothing. No palace, no army, no power to protect the people he had finally learned to see. The sacrifice was complete and devastating. "You fool," Bjorn breathed, but his voice held more confusion than anger now. "You hand me the kingdom, and for what? Pretty words about service? Noble sentiment that will not feed a single starving child or defend a single border?" Ragnar met his eyes steadily. "I hand you the kingdom because taking it by force would make you everything I was, a ruler who values power over people. But perhaps, having won it freely, you might remember what it means to serve rather than simply rule." The courtyard had fallen into stunned silence. Nobles, who had spent weeks plotting rebellion, found themselves holding victory that tasted like ash. Commoners, who had traveled days for an audience with their king, watched him transform into something unprecedented, a leader who chose his people's welfare over his own position. But in that moment of apparent triumph for the old order, something unexpected began to happen. A weathered farm woman stepped forward from the crowd, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "If our king will not wear the crown," she said slowly, "then perhaps the crown needs to change." Other voices joined hers, a blacksmith, a river fisherman, a young mother carrying a child. "Aye," they murmured. "Aye, let the crown change." Lord Bjorn's face went pale as he realized the true cost of victory won through force. He might claim the throne, but he would rule over a people who had seen what kingship could become when it chose service over dominance. The old order was dying, and nothing he could do would bring it back to life. Ragnar had sacrificed everything: crown, identity, power, future. But in losing everything, he had finally learned what it meant to be a king. The real work was only beginning. The farm woman's declaration hung in the morning air like the first note of a song no one had heard before. For a heartbeat, the courtyard remained frozen, nobles clutching at a victory that had somehow transformed into defeat, commoners staring at their abdicated king as if seeing the sun rise in the west. Then the blacksmith stepped forward, his massive hands folded respectfully, but his voice unwavering. "Begging your pardons, lords, but we came here because our children are starving, not for politics or proper protocol." His weathered face turned toward Ragnar. "You say you renounce the crown to serve us better. Then serve us, crown or no crown." A murmur rippled through the crowd of commoners, and Ragnar felt something shift in the very foundations of the moment. These people had not traveled for days to witness a transfer of power between nobles. They had come seeking hope, and somehow, impossibly, his renunciation had given them exactly that. Lord Bjorn's sword hung forgotten in his hand, as he stared at the unfolding scene with growing horror. "This is madness," he whispered. "Without proper authority, without the sacred order of rule—" "The sacred order failed us," called out the young mother, bouncing her hollow-cheeked child with practiced ease. 20 years of sacred order, and my babe has never known a full belly." "Aye," agreed the river fisherman. "Sacred order that takes our grain for export while we eat bark soup." Eric Stormbreaker stood frozen beside his former king, watching 20 years of certainty crumble around him. "Ragnar," he said quietly, his voice thick with something between grief and terror, "what have you done? How can you lead without authority? How can you protect without power?" Ragnar felt the question like a physical blow because he had no answer. The crown had been his identity for so long that its absence felt like missing a limb. Everything he knew about leadership, about governance, about his place in the world had been bound up in royal authority. Now he stood among his people as just a man, mortal, fallible, powerless to command obedience or enforce his will. But as the fear threatened to crush him, Astrid's words echoed in his memory. "The divine sees not the crown upon your head, but the choices you make when no one is watching." "I don't know," he admitted, the words falling like stones. "I don't know how to lead without commanding or protect without conquering, but I know that 20 years of absolute power taught me nothing about the lives I was responsible for." He looked around the gathered faces, nobles pale with shock, commoners bright with desperate hope. "Perhaps it's time to learn together." The farm woman who had first spoken stepped closer, her eyes studying Ragnar's face with the shrewd assessment of someone who had spent a lifetime reading the truth in men's hearts. "You mean it?" she said slowly. "You truly mean to serve rather than rule?" "I mean to try," Ragnar replied. "Though I warn you, I know nothing about farming or fishing or the daily struggles you face. I will need teachers." A laugh broke from the blacksmith, rough but not unkind. "Well then, you'll have plenty of them. Every man, woman, and child here could teach you something about surviving hard times." Lord Bjorn found his voice at last, though it cracked with disbelief. "This is chaos. A kingdom cannot be governed by committee. There must be hierarchy, order, proper chain of command." "Then establish it," Ragnar said quietly, turning to face his former vassal. "Take the crown, Bjorn. Rule as you believe a king should rule. But know that you will govern a changed people, subjects who have seen what leadership looks like when it chooses humility over dominance." The weight of that truth settled over the assembled nobles like a shroud. They had won their rebellion, but the prize had transformed in their hands. How could they return to the old ways when their people had witnessed something unprecedented, a king who valued their welfare over his own position? In the growing silence, Ragnar felt the enormity of what lay ahead. He had no palace, no treasury, no army to command. Winter was coming, and the drought showed no signs of breaking. The people who looked to him with such desperate hope had needs he could not meet, problems he could not solve through royal decree. But for the first time in 20 years, he was not facing those challenges alone. Around him stood farmers who understood the land, craftsmen who knew how to build, fishermen who could read the signs of changing weather. The wisdom he needed was here, had always been here, waiting for a leader humble enough to listen. The real work was indeed beginning. Not the work of ruling, but the far more difficult task of learning to serve. And as Ragnar looked into the faces of his people, he felt something he had not experienced since that transformative meal in the drought-stricken forest. The possibility of redemption earned through sacrifice rather than seized through strength. The crown was gone. The kingdom was changed. And somehow, impossibly, that felt like the beginning of hope rather than the end of everything he had known. 3 moons had passed since the crown fell, and the man who had once been King Ragnar Ironwolf knelt beside a dying well, his hands black with earth and his back aching from labor he had never known as a ruler. The irony was not lost on him. He had spent decades commanding armies, yet digging for water had nearly defeated him. "Deeper," advised Thorkel the farm steward, squinting at the muddy hole. "The spring's still there, but drought's driven it down past where lazy hands can reach." Ragnar wiped sweat from his brow, leaving a streak of mud across his forehead. Around him, a dozen villagers worked with quiet efficiency, some hauling stones for the well wall, others weaving new rope. This was Astrid's village, the place where everything had begun, and he was beginning to understand where it would truly end. He had returned here not as a king seeking subjects, but as a man seeking the woman who had shown him what kingship truly meant. The irony cut deep. In losing his crown, he had finally become worthy of the lesson she had tried to teach him. "Ragnar." Her voice came softly from behind him, and he turned to see Astrid approaching with a clay cup of water. She looked exactly as she had that first day, worn by hardship but radiant with an inner strength that no crown could match. "You should rest." He accepted the water gratefully, their fingers brushing as he took the cup. The touch sent the same shock through him as it had in the forest, recognition of something vast and sacred wearing mortal form. "I keep thinking," he said quietly, "about that moment when you offered me your last bread. You knew, didn't you? Even then you knew what I needed to learn." Astrid's smile held depths he was only beginning to fathom. "I knew you were lost. Whether you could find your way home?" She gestured toward the villagers working around them. "That was always your choice to make." The word home struck him with unexpected force. For 3 moons he had wandered from village to village, helping where he could, learning from people he had once ruled from a distance. But this place, this simple settlement where a goddess had fed him humanity along with bread, this felt like arrival rather than just another stop. "The nobles think me mad," he admitted. "Eric visits weekly, begging me to reclaim the throne. Says Lord Bjorn rules through fear and the kingdom bleeds from a dozen small rebellions. And what do you tell him? That the kingdom was already bleeding. We were simply too proud to see the wounds." Ragnar set down the empty cup and looked toward the distant mountains where his former palace stood. "Bjorn will learn, as I learned. Or he will fall, as I should have fallen long ago." From across the village came the sound of children's laughter, a sound that had become precious to him in ways his younger self could never have understood. 3 months ago, those children had been hollow-eyed with hunger. Now they played in the dust, their cheeks fuller thanks to wells dug by willing hands rather than commanded labor. "You could take it back," Astrid said quietly. "The crown, half the lords would rally to you now, seeing how Bjorn's harshness breeds only more rebellion." "With what right?" The question came without bitterness, only genuine wonder. "I spent 20 years proving myself unworthy of absolute power. Would 3 months of humility change that?" Astrid stepped closer, and in her presence he felt again that sense of standing before something infinite wearing finite form. The worthiest rulers are those who question their worthiness. The strongest kings are those who know their weakness. Then perhaps, Ragnar said slowly, the strongest kingdom would be one that does not depend on kings at all. The words surprised him as he spoke them, but they felt true in a way that royal proclamations never had. Around them, the village functioned not through royal decree, but through shared purpose. Wells were dug because people needed water. Fields were tended because people needed grain. Children were protected because children needed protection. A kingdom without kings, Astrid mused, ruled by those who serve rather than those who command. Led by you, Ragnar said quietly. You have been teaching them, haven't you? Not just this village, but others, showing them that strength lies in community rather than conquest. Her silence was answer enough. He had suspected for weeks, watching how the villagers moved with quiet confidence, how they spoke of distant settlements with familiarity, how news traveled faster than any royal messenger could carry it. The goddess was spreading her lessons through mortal hands, preparing the ground for something unprecedented. "Will you stay?" she asked. The question hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Stay, and accept that his transformation was complete, that the king was truly dead and only the man remained. Stay, and help birth something new from the ashes of everything he had once believed about power. "If you'll have me," he said, not as a king seeking subjects, but as a student seeking wisdom. When she smiled, Ragnar saw in her face the future he had never dared imagine, a realm ruled by compassion rather than conquest, governed by those who served rather than those who commanded. The kingdom was changing, village by village, heart by heart, and for the first time in his life, he was exactly where he belonged. The seasons turned, and what had once seemed impossible became the rhythm of ordinary days. Ragnar woke each morning not to the clatter of armor and urgent dispatches, but to the gentle sounds of a village stirring to life, children's voices carrying across the square, the steady thunk of axes splitting wood, the creak of cartwheels on packed earth. 2 years had passed since he knelt by that dying well, and the man who emerged from his small cottage bore little resemblance to the king who had once commanded from a throne of carved stone. His hands were permanently stained with honest work, his back bent slightly from labor, his face lined not with the weight of crown decisions, but with the deeper satisfaction of problems solved through patience rather than power. "The eastern settlements are asking for help with their harvest," Astrid said, approaching with the easy familiarity that had grown between them like grain in fertile soil. She carried a bundle of messages, not royal scrolls sealed with wax and authority, but simple letters written by farmers to farmers, neighbors to neighbors. Ragnar accepted the bundle, scanning the careful script with eyes that had learned to read need rather than political maneuvering. "How many can we spare?" "Thorkel thinks 15 hands for 2 weeks, if the weather holds." She settled beside him on the worn wooden bench outside their cottage. Their cottage, he mused, still marveling at how naturally that possessive had emerged. "Though young Bjorn wants to take 30, says it's our duty to help where we can." He smiled at the mention of Thorkel's son, named ironically for the lord who had seized his abandoned crown and ruled it into civil war within 18 months. The boy bore his namesake's fierce determination but none of his selfishness, having grown up in a world where leadership meant service rather than dominance. 15 is wise, Ragnar decided. We help as we can without weakening ourselves. The young learn balance through example, not grand gestures. Astrid nodded, her approval warming him more than any royal accolade ever had. In the early days he had struggled with such decisions, his instinct still reaching for the absolute authority of royal decree rather than the patient calculation of community needs. She had taught him, through countless gentle corrections, that true leadership was not about having all the answers, but about asking the right questions. A commotion from the village center drew their attention. Eric Stormbreaker stood in the square, his traveling clothes dust-covered and his face bearing the weariness of a man who had ridden hard with urgent news. The sight of his former captain still stirred complex emotions in Ragnar. Grief for their shattered brotherhood, guilt for the burden his choices had placed on loyal shoulders. "My lord," Eric called, then caught himself with a familiar wince. "Ragnar, I bring word from the capital." They gathered in the square as they always did for important news, not in formal audience but in the comfortable circle of neighbors sharing the day's concerns. Eric looked around at the faces surrounding him with something approaching wonder, as if still unable to believe that governance could function without hierarchy and ceremony. "Lord Bjorn is dead," Eric announced without preamble, "killed in his own throne room by his starving guards. The capital burns with riot and rebellion. The noble houses call for your return. They say only the rightful king can restore order." Ragnar felt the words settle around him like snow, cold and silent. There was grief in them. Bjorn had been a decent man corrupted by the very power Ragnar had once wielded without wisdom. There was opportunity, too, the chance to reclaim everything he had sacrificed. "And what do you say, old friend?" Ragnar asked gently. Eric's voice cracked with old pain. "I say the kingdom bleeds while its true king plays at being a farmer. I say duty calls you home, regardless of the cost to your newfound peace." The assembled villagers waited quietly, their faces thoughtful but not anxious. They had learned, in 2 years of shared struggle, that panic solved nothing and that the best decisions grew from patient consideration rather than urgent reaction. "The kingdom was bleeding long before I left," Ragnar said finally. "And it will heal only when its people learn what we have learned here, that strength comes from community, not crown, that leadership grows from service, not dominance." He stood slowly, feeling the ache in his joints that came from honest work rather than ceremonial posture. "Tell the noble houses this. Let them choose their own king from among themselves. Let them learn to govern by consent rather than force. And let them know that here in the villages, we are building something new, a realm where power flows upward from the people rather than downward from a throne." Eric stared at him with the expression of a man watching the last familiar landmark disappear. "You truly mean to let it all burn?" "No," Ragnar replied, taking Astrid's hand in his calloused fingers. "I mean to let it transform, as I was transformed by love greater than any crown could contain." The future stretched before them, uncertain but filled with the quiet hope of seeds planted in willing ground. The king was dead, the man remained, and that, at last, was enough.